All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Museum Connections 2023. My name is Claire Delangeau. I'm the director of the show, and I'm very happy to be with you for the 27th edition of Museum Connections. We'll be spending the next 2 days together with a program that is focused on two main topics. The first one is how to rethink the cultural area, and the second one is the cultural impact. So we'll be starting with ICOM. They will be telling us about the perspectives and what is at stake with the new definition of a museum. And then we'll be looking at the role that culture and heritage can play in helping the integration of newcomers. And then for the end of the morning, we'll be talking about young people and the impact that they can have. In the afternoon, we'll be looking at the pop-up store jury. We'll be talking about retail, the retail experience. Then we'll be discussing art and taking care of your audience. In the afternoon, we'll be talking about responsible digital choices, and then we'll be talking about immersive technologies and environmental responsibility. I would like to thank the Inspiration Board, people with us all year long to help us define the topics of our conferences and help us also identify the right speakers for our conferences. And I would like now to turn to Annabelle TÜRKIS, who coordinated the whole program and who will be taking care of you for the next 2 days. I would like to wish you an excellent conference for the next 2 days and enjoy the show. Good morning, everyone, and we'll be starting off soon. I would like to thank you for being here. I am speaking in the name of ICOM France. I would like to thank the organizers for having us. And at the end of the conferences, if you want to talk with us, we have a stand right there, so you can come talk to us. My name is Emilie GIRARD. I am the curator of heritage, and I work at ICOM France. I have taken my duties from Juliette. I used to be her vice president, so I've been with ICOM for a few years now. I'm very happy to be sharing the stage with her today to talk about this new definition of a museum. This is a discussion that has been strongly debated within ICOM for a few years now. And today we'll have the opportunity to talk about this process and talk with you about that. We want to have a slot for an open discussion. We want to know what you think about what we're going to tell you. Juliette, would you like to say a few words? Yes, thank you, Emilie. And I too would like to thank the organizers for having us. I was there last year already. And I remember that we had opened a debate that was of very high quality, and I'm hoping that we'll have very enriching questions this year as well. I think that you have already heard the main points. Emilie just told you that I have been president of ICOM France for the past 6 years. Emilie is now the president. She's been elected in October. And for all those years, there was indeed a heated discussion within ICOM about the definition of museums within our working group. We'll have the opportunity to discuss those discussions today again. And during the Prague General Conference, the new definition was voted on. And I was then elected president of ICOM Europe, which is why I'm still here today. All right, and let's cut to the chase. I think very briefly, I'll just remind you of what ICOM is for those of you who might not be familiar with us. It's an old organization that was created in 1946. It's the main professional organization focusing on museum issues internationally. And I have a few figures for you. 45,000 members in 140 countries, which means that we have a very broad network, a very dense network as well. We have a code of ethics that has been translated in 38 languages as to date. And what brings together the museum community is that code of ethics, because we work together on deontology and we are reviewing this code. This is one of our main streams of work right now. So I think that we'll be talking about that a little bit today as well. It's very important for an organization like ours to always be up to date with the environment that we work in. So ICOM is a very big structure. And we work through national committees. So ICOM France, for example, with its 5,500 members. It's one of our main committees, actually. Those national bureaus then brought together in networks, and Juliette is now the president of the European network. They obviously work on our main topics. And then we have international committees which bring together professionals of the topic around issues of common interest. Of course, there's the ICOFOP on museology, SECA on education, ICOM-CC on conservatorship and restoration issues, Intercom that works on management and leadership in museums. So when you adhere to a national committee, you have the possibility to, and we strongly encourage you, to also adhere to an international committee. That's very important because it makes it possible to have an exchange of views that is very rich and vibrant on a day-to-day basis with foreign members of the same committee. And then there are ad hoc committees that are created as needed, such as the DEFINE group, for example. And this group has been working for a few years on the definition of museums, which again has been voted on in Prague in August last year, with 92% people voting pro in favor of this new definition after years and years of heated debate. And Juliette, I would like to kick off by asking you a question that might seem a little bit obvious, but I think it's interesting to look back at the reasons for this work on the definition. Why do we need one? What is the point of having this definition for ICOM? Why is it so important, and why are professionals so invested in this? Well, thank you, Emilie, for introducing the topic and giving us so much detail. So the definition of a museum, maybe we could have the next slide. All right. For ICOM, having a definition of a museum, this is a very structuring element. We call it our spine because we think that it is necessary for us to have this definition, that it really is part of our foundation. And it is part of our statutes, actually. But what's the point of defining a museum? We all have a dictionary at home, and we all know what a museum is, more or less. So why do we need an international professional organization to look at it and to decide on a specific definition? Well, because of what I just said. First, because it's a professional organization, and second, because it's an international organization. So this definition of a museum, it makes it possible to look at what a museum is for professionals, and it also impacts the definition of what it means to be a professional in the museum space. So this definition of a museum by ICOM, it's also a way of unifying things within the organization. It's important to make sure that all the national committees and international committees of ICOM all use the same definition, that we all agree on what the most important parts are. So when national committees are shining a light on museums and what a museum is in their national documents, we need to have the same basic definitions. So this is a normative definition, of course. So it tells you what a museum is. We are part of a non-governmental organization. Emilie already mentioned the fact that we are an international organization as well. And as such, ICOM can support professionals in whatever country they may be in, and in particular, support professionals who do not have access to legal tools as solid as those that we have in France, for example. So having this definition is something that you can use in the legal space as well. And they can go in the legal space in their country and say, this is a museum, and this is what a museum is not. For example, a museum is not a place for selling things. A museum is a place where you have research, where you have exhibitions or something like that. But if you don't have a legal definition that you can use, it's very difficult to defend it nationally. So that's one of the elements that we have. It has a legal impact. And this can support the activity of a number of national committees. Now, another thing is that ICOM is a professional organization. And that was part of the discussion in 2019. We are professionals of the museum world, 40,000 professionals. And we are the biggest professional organization today. Of course, I'm boasting a little bit, but still, I think it's true. So when you define professionals of the museum space, then you're also saying who gets to be part of ICOM. You get to define who is actually working as a professional, whose activities are part of this professional world, and that's important as well. But why is it important? Why does it matter? Well, being able to say who's a professional is part of the debate that we've had. Having trouble with my headset, but still. What was I saying? This was part of our discussion for the last 3 years. Thank you. All right, so today, we're not going to be discussing the definition itself, but we are going to be discussing the new definition of the museum. It might have seemed a bit extravagant that for the last 3 years ICOM has been fighting internally as to this definition. But again, this work on the definition of a museum, this is something that we've had ever since the birth of ICOM. And we've had this work again and again within ICOM. Museums have evolved a lot over the last 75 years. I'm not teaching you anything new here. And as I wrote on my slide, there have been quite a few reviews and updating of this definition. I listed the dates here from 1951 to 2022. And every time we have an update of this definition, we have a vote in the General Assembly that takes place every 3 years within ICOM. So we have a formal vote. This is part of our statutes. And that means that we have a vote of our members. And this vote is always a tense moment. Because if we want to change anything in our statutes, we need to have a 2/3 majority. So that means that we need to have a broad consensus before we can change anything. Right. I said a few words about what we call the Kyoto crisis within ICOM. Now, I was there, and I can tell you that the debates were very heated, almost violent, in September 2019. this was a time of high tensions, and there was even a risk of having a schism within ICOM. So what happened in Kyoto? Why such a tension? We're going to be looking at the definition, the 2007 definition, to explain that. So we were reviewing the 2007 definition, and there was a proposal in 2019 that was rejected, and now in 2022 we had one that was adopted. What were the differences, Juliette? You can see them on screen. We're showing them here to be able to better discuss them, but first you might want to look at them as I'm introducing the topic. I think it's worth saying that ICOM France has played a leadership role in this debate on the definition of museums and the problems that come with it. So you can see here three different definitions, three proposals. If you look at them, you can see that the 2007 definition, the one that we had for 12 years, is very short. It's very to the point. And it's quite easy to understand. And it's also easy to translate. And that's not something that is just on the margin of the discussion, because if you want to discuss the definition, you need to have something that is easily translated into all the languages that ICOM works with. So it tells you that a museum is a permanent institution, a not-for-profit institution in the service of society that researches, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. For research, study, and pleasure. So that's a simple definition. In 2016, we met during the General Conference in Milan, and the members of the conference thought that the definition was indeed quite clear and straightforward. However, it was missing a number of elements. So there were a number of keywords that they wanted to see in the definition. There were things that they wanted to discuss and change and update. And that is when a working group was launched. It was not called DEFINE back then. It was called the Committee for the Definition of Museum, with an acronym to go with it. And we had a chairperson who was Danish, and she was very invested in this topic and in the topic of new museums in particular. She was the founder of a museum, a women's museum or feminism museum, I don't remember, in Denmark. She was leading this task force, and this working group worked on the issue for 2 to 3 years and produced two things. First, a report, and second, a proposal for a new definition. And I would like to say a few more words about both those things. The work that this working group had carried out was not limited to just the idea that they needed to improve on the working definition that they had. Instead, there was a lot of deep thinking about what museums were becoming and on what they thought would be the future missions of museums. In other words, it was not just a linguistic work. It was not just about finding the right words to describe what was already there, or to find a way to have everybody agree on the definition. Instead, the working group started thinking very in-depth about what museums were becoming. And the report was published in January or February or 2019. And back then, it was not really, it did not really trigger a lot of reactions, actually. But I think it was very interesting, though. You can find the report on the ICOM website, ICOM in general and ICOM France as well. You can find it in French at the very least. It's about 15 pages long, and it's very interesting because it looks at the place that museums have in today's society and at the new missions that it's taking. It looks at democratization of museums, at education, at the role that museums should have as well. So a lot of very interesting things and very important things are to be found in this report. But at the same time, it is also divisive because it opposes things in a way that I find to be a bit political, because it opposes the way that different regions work with museums in different ways. So it opposes Occidental Western museums and says that Western museums have been created to host the colonial plundering of the Western world. They say it practically in those terms. So that is very divisive, obviously. And after 2019, it became obvious that it was very provocative. I wanted to say those words to make it easier for you to understand why there were such heated reactions. But if you look at the debate that we're having today on many different topics, on restitutions, for example, on decolonization of museums, you can see that this report was saying things that are becoming mainstream now. It's not minority thinking. It's a very important debate to have, even though it's very political. So the chairwoman is very inspired by this notion that museums have to transform in a radical fashion. And in a near future. So the group worked on the definition of the museum based on those thoughts. And this report is very well documented and very interesting, maybe too much, because of that, because of this load of information that you can find in it, some aspects were not really picked up on after publication. So it was published in January or February, and practically at the same time, ICOM launched a consultation calling upon its 45,000 members to formulate what they thought the ideal definition of a museum should be. In May, June of the same year, we had 269 proposals for a new definition. It's not a lot, 200 to 300 definitions from 45,000 members. And Emilie will tell us about the analysis and the work that she carried out on those definitions. Some of them were a bit well, what should I say? They were a bit more fantasy-laden, but then we discussed it in Kyoto in June, and by early July, we had a surprise. On July 25th, a definition was published on the international website, and it was a single definition. And it was stated then on the website that none of the 269 definitions were kept for this definition, and that instead there was a single definition that was published. And the website basically said, this is the definition that we have now, and we're hoping that you enjoyed your summer. You're going to come to Kyoto and vote on this definition and no other. And I'm going to show it on screen now. And you'll see that it is quite different from the 2007 definition, both in its style and in the concept.
And so it says that a museum is a polyphonic place devoted to a dialogue addressing questions of a conflict. They are repositories of knowledge to preserve the memory and asserts the gender equality. Well, I'm not going to read it all to you, so that museums are not for profit and they work in a permanent collaboration at the service of society for research, collection, and to preserve and interpret the tangible and intangible heritage, and must contribute to equality and education and well-being. So when you come across that definition, well, in fact, quite a few people, in fact, not just the French representatives, said that there's something wrong here. And so it's very difficult to understand straight away what's going on because we hadn't seen the report. People hadn't read all of those proposals. And so in mid-August, 27 national committees were gathering and were asking the chair, the president of the ICOM, not to submit that definition to a vote, that there would have to be more debate. And so perhaps Emilie will have more to say about this. So what was shocking about this definition? Well, first of all, it's very long, very difficult to understand. It's very difficult to translate as well. We need everyone speaking pretty much the same language in a definition. But beyond that, they're no longer considered permanent institutions. In fact, so removing that notion of the permanent institution was a shock to many. And then also, and so it's just being called a place. So that might be temporary, open or close. And so this is in contradiction with the whole idea of preserving collections, of collecting and preserving them with the skills and the resources necessary for that. And so if these places are more about democratization, as this new definition proposed, rather than as an institution, it also talks about inclusion and polyphonic, so and multiple voices. Okay, it's true that some of those terms are now more widely accepted, but the whole notion of a polyphonic place, well, what does it mean exactly? I mean, it almost sounds like a concert hall. So that is not necessarily characteristic of a museum. So we're not hostile to this idea because a museum should be devoted to dialogue and analysis. But in that particular order, you could see that the emphasis is being shifted. So really shunting to a secondary position what many of us consider the main role of a museum is to document and research and collect and preserve so that audiences can benefit from these collections, and this requires resources to be shared, of course. So here, the terminology is highly politicized. They're talking about artifacts and not so much about collections anymore. And they talk about guaranteeing equal access and human dignity, social justice, and planetary well-being. Okay, well, museums contribute to these, but it seems quite strange to find them set out so boldly in a definition, whereas the ICOM has always been proud of being a professional organization and not a political organization, that we are devoted to professional excellence and not an organization devoted to human rights. Although, of course, the whole notion of human rights and all of the other notions evoked in that definition are important to us. So the content of this definition really irritated many or shocked many. Also, you know, the process had not been followed as well. There hadn't been the debate, so it hadn't been a democratic approach. So you can't, you know, there had been 269 different proposals put forward that were swept away. In fact, and so for us, you know, many of us felt that, you know, when we arrived at Kyoto in September 2019, and this topic was really going to be the most prominent issue. And there were conflicts then all across the organization. We had never seen such a level of conflict. Now, of course, any organization as old as ours, 75 years, will have its moments of tension. But normally, you know, the atmosphere is rather professional. But here it was open conflict. And so a movement began to say, all right, you know, you have to postpone submitting this definition for the vote to a different time. We are not ready. No one is ready. We have a, you know, and we were asking quite firmly that there be more insistence on the fact that we are a professional organization, because here we can see that there is an attempt to transform ICOM itself through this definition as well. So we called for a more democratic process, and we won out, but the president refused to postpone the vote, and out of the 4,000 members, well, the majority voted to postpone, in fact, well, voted against that definition and asked that that there be further debate on the definition. And so, Emilie, you worked a great deal on the 269 proposals. I'm sure you'd like to say a few things. Well, yes, we analyzed all of the different terms that came out of the 269 proposals, and we grouped them in various themes. Okay, so the idea of acquisitions and acquiring things like that. We looked at terms like that and looked at how frequently certain terms emerged. And we could see that there was quite a gap with the new proposed definition. What we could see that there were many of the fundamentals came out of the 269 proposals to do with collecting and transmitting knowledge, which had been shunted down to a less important status. The question of the polyphonic, I mean, this was a word that simply appeared nowhere in the 269 proposals. And so, of course, this was subject of a very heated debate because polyphonic was beginning to sound like a cacophonic or chaotic situation. And so the as Juliette said, many considered the text to be too politicized. You know, for me, for example, in particularly the last sentence, improving the understanding of the word to contribute to human dignity, social justice, and planetary well-being. For me, I simply did not feel any connection between that and a museum. I mean, the definition is about describing the DNA of what is a museum. And so here, what we saw in that last sentence was, rather than being inclusive, it would exclude those who simply would not feel capable of understanding such a declaration, and in particular in some countries, not particularly democratic countries. The Iranian representative, for example, said, "How do you expect me to go home with that definition and get that accepted and applied to become effective?" So the idea is that the text must be applicable in the 140 member countries. So that's a quick overview of what we call the Kyoto crisis. So in 2022, we have arrived at this definition that you see on the screen. So perhaps we can come back to the methodology that was put in place to arrive at this definition, and which the ICOM presents as a model of a democratic approach. And so I think it's interesting to have a look and to understand the scope of the work that was conducted to arrive at this definition. Thank you, Emilie. I know I was too wordy earlier, so just very quickly on what happened after Kyoto. Now, of course, we continued our work at the ICOM France, and there was a major publication in French and English. There are a few copies here that you can have a look at. And so there was in 2020 in March, in fact, there was an entire conference day devoted to this. And there were 160 attendees at that conference. I mean, of course, this was right in the midst of COVID. So we came out of it with two key ideas. First of all, that we would have to establish a democratic process so the definition would emanate from the work of the members, first of all. And the second key idea was to go back to a definition that is useful and understandable and translatable. So it would have to be a simpler language. And so how then could we restore a democratic process? I mean, okay, it might have sounded democratic just to toss out a definition and get people to vote on it. But in fact, in practice, it didn't work. So a new working group was put together, the Define working group, with two leaders from Latin America. But there were a lot of different profiles participating in the working group. And we wanted to think about a participative methodology for this. And we really had to create it as we went, as we debated. So it would have to be the members should be able to express their ideas freely, and that we be able to get as much feedback as possible. So the methodology meant that we would be sending out to via the national committees, we would ask all members to contribute because these representatives are elected, and they should be the organizers and coordinators of a consultation process. And so we put in place the timing for this so that everyone could clearly see the timing for the consultation, and so there would be 4 or 5 months ahead of time before the next conference in Prague. And there were going to be 4 stages of the consultation: getting members' opinion about the choices of terminology, first of all. And so we began by asking, what are the words that you feel must appear in this definition? So, of course, we made some suggestions coming from the old definition, the new one, and we asked them to express themselves. So which words do you want to see appear? And one thing that was a surprise for us, a happy surprise in many ways, was, first of all, over half of the national committees were able to launch the consultation, first of all. That is a lot of people consulted, in fact. And I think in France, in fact, I think we had about 300 replies. And the key words that emerged for defining a museum, we saw that from all over the world, the same things came back. And, you know, we were no longer hearing these unusual terms like polyphony. And so we once again went through this process of sorting through those terms and grouping them. And each time, the consultation stages were then reported up. And this allowed us to then put forward the most key terms. It was hugely participative, and but the working group decided that it would in no circumstances put forward its own definition, not to write it and then submit it for approval. We went about things very differently. We resumed the consultation in various stages to try to then filter down to the words that had been selected and reselected by the different national committees. And then we had to, you know, it was a bit like a puzzle in a way. And so we began to finally formulate them into sentences. And so this was the work done in the working group. But we did stick to the priorities expressed by the members. And so a lot of time was devoted to organizing the words and separating the synonyms, for example. But we had to be very focused on how they would be translated, because these are going to appear in all documents of ICOM. They must be understandable. There are 60 languages. There's only 3 official languages, but there are 60 languages used by the members of ICOM. And so we had to be very careful to ensure the translatability of the terms. Because, okay, I think we only have 3 or 4 minutes left in the session. But so what do we do now? So we've got this new definition, but the matter is not closed. In fact, now ICOM France spoke up about a certain word, such as divertissement in French, or entertainment. Are museums there to entertain? Does this work for every type of museum? So what do we do with that word? So how do we move forward? How do we apply that and other terms, of course? Yes, thank you for raising that point. So if you read the definition, you'll see that we're coming back closely to the 2007 definition. There are some new words have been introduced that updated about diversity, sustainability, communities as well, that many members felt was important. Entertainment was the subject of a lot of discussion. Well, the French delegation were not too enthused about that, but we did work on the order of the words. Okay, research comes out first, in fact. Research, collection, conservation, interpretation, exhibition. Okay, and these were chosen in that order by the members. Now we've got French, English, and Spanish, which are the official languages of ICOM. But now the work is underway to get it translated in the member languages. So 92% of votes were in favor of this definition in Prague. And I think people were very relieved, in fact, at Prague after all of that hostility in Kyoto. And so it was important that we were able to put in place a real methodology. And so this also allowed all of the other languages to work from there as well, referring back to the initial originals of French, English, and Spanish, and they were encouraged, of course, to work together. So what we can say about this definition, this has been approved. It appears in the Articles of Association, and it shall remain in place for a certain time. But what's important is that it must be disseminated across the 140 member countries and applied. It has to be really the backbone of our organization. And so right now, it's the translations that are underway in the other languages. And so, as you can see, that, it is a very consensual definition. So sorry, I was so talkative. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Very enlightening. Are there any questions from the audience? Hello, everyone. Marie-Hélène Avril. So thank you so much for explaining that to us. I have a question. So once it has been translated, in concrete terms, what will this definition change? What will the professionals then do with this? Because often a definition is rather theoretic, and so the challenge is then that in practice it be applied and perhaps even inspire some changes. Well, that's a tough question because, perhaps things should you make it sound like we should have gone about things differently, that it should have been inspired from practices rather than to say, how are you going to apply it? So it's the difference between a definition or a mission statement. So what do we do with it then? Well, Juliette has talked about this, and it's there could be challenges to the current definition, but, the importance of having this definition. Well, in France, we have a legal framework for the definition of a museum, but many countries don't. And so, in fact, the question is, will this be applicable in other countries? So that will be interesting to follow. So I think the work of translation will help shed light on some of these questions of application of, is it practical? Well, yes, if I could add something. Yes, a definition has to be useful. If it's not useful or usable, well, then there's no point, is there? But at the same time, it was an disciplined way to gather our forces, like a founding text, if you will. It's like, part of our articles, there's certain points of ethics about the translation, and we are updating our ethics charter. And the tools, this is a tool, and it has to be functional. At the same time, yes, there will always be revisions, and we can already start thinking about revisions, because between 2020 and 2022, there's been, COVID, war, climate change. And so many are already wondering about, perhaps, what are the obligation of museums to preserve their collections in the case of armed conflict in their territories. But it always brings things back to the professionals and what professionals do. If I could make a comment, please. When we talk about intangible works, digital works or digital rendering, what could be an intangible museum? I think that might be a challenge for the future museum. Will we accept the notion of a metaverse museum, for example? Well, the working group on the ethics charter only touched on this briefly, the NFTs, for example, which do raise serious ethical questions. So I think we're going to have to be very careful in the coming months. I think this is going to be a big challenge for the future of our museums and how we set a framework for future trends. And so we are going to have to address these issues. We cannot simply ignore them. Now, in Prague, it's true that the question wasn't raised, but we will certainly be raising this point at the next general meetings. Well, I think a central question is audiences, the visitors, okay, very much focused to visitors, but in fact, in France, we had to pass a law to put the visitors and audiences more at the forefront. So an intangible museum, well, we have to wonder about access. Is it democratic? I don't know. Yes. Do people need to have access from their living room? I don't know if I have an answer to that. All right. Well, thank you so much, ladies. There's one last question. A comment about the difference in terms of between intangible heritage and dematerialized. I mean, it's two different things. The intangible heritage is something emerging from traditions and practices, ways of living and doing. But when we talk about digital things, this is that's not the intangible. So be careful in the terms that you choose, because something that is digitized and intangible is not the same. You're quite right. You're quite right.